Welcome to this episode of Abide in Me, How Jesus Models Secure Attachment with God. This series is a survey of the Gospel of Mark, looking for how Jesus models what is now called secure attachment, which is the physiological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual experience of what is often called salvation or regeneration or being conjoined with God or enlightenment, individuation, even becoming spiritual. Through the series, we will discover the benefits of becoming securely attached with God, which is the transformation of one's life into one of joy and satisfaction. We continue in our review of the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus has just fed thousands of people, and we read that immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida while he sent the people home. And after telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. And the story that follows is a wonderful example of storytelling because it makes spiritual and psychological realities powerful and applicable in our lives. Before we get to the story, I have to make some observations. For instance, I observe an evolution of the human spirit from what I read and hear from the experts and the wise people in our history. And that evolution is an opening on ever deeper levels to the love and wisdom from God, from the universe, from the source. This process of advancement or evolution on its grandest scale is always the fulfilling of the will of the divine love expressing the divine truth. That's happening for sure. That is divine providence, the divine will at work through the eras of human history. However, in our individual experience, this development of a higher or deeper consciousness is messy. Just think back to your teen years, right? And now in recent history, in current events, we read and are experiencing changes happening in multiple arenas of life. To our individual, time-bound, and so limited view, it is chaos. Yet I am convinced that a higher, broader, and less time-bound view will show us not a divinely caused chaos, but a divinely ordained advance in spirituality. By that I mean the development of a perception of self-worth, of a place in the universe, of the significance of relationships and the significance of loss, and less dependence on sensations and the resulting physiological patterns and reactions. Now, we care about observing these developments because our inner spiritual development always seeks a new outer expression, which our outer life, our natural life, finds strange and often threatening. We have all experienced resistance to changing our behavior and a gradual adaptation of our external life to our spiritual life. That's the way it has normally worked for us. Why? Why is changing a belief or an emotional response such a complex cognitive and emotional process requiring years of development? Why is it so hard to let go of an idea we believe that accounts for the way the world works for us? Why is it so hard to change an emotional response to stimuli? Well, I subscribe to the widely held notion that God has wired us to favor consistency and holding on to learned responses for the sake of self-preservation and maintaining the ability to reproduce. If our brain was able to simply switch from one belief to another, forgetting the lesson it learned or never acquiring a pattern of response, then, for instance, when our ancient ancestor heard the noise of a saber-toothed tiger, he or she might say, "Oh, well, that's not a saber-toothed tiger. I believe it's something else." And then, of course, our species wouldn't have survived. An example today, perhaps, is the need to be right. If I believe that I am right, and that works to make my world a better place for me, then for me to just willy-nilly give up that belief would mean that I would live a life that was unproductive, unsettled, uncertain. I'd make more errors. I wouldn't learn from my mistakes. I would not have a youthful desire to strive to make myself and the world a better place. Or, for instance, the need for certainty, which is so commonly looked at as a source of anxiety these days. It's the same thing. That certainty gives us a sense of place and as being settled and knowing who and what we are in relationship to the world. And that is very hard to change. And people will take many weeks of therapy, for instance, to change their relationship to their need for certainty to manage their anxiety. And we all have an emotional bond with our point of view. We love what we believe. That's why we believe it. If that love was too weak a force, we wouldn't choose to live and reproduce in the face of existential challenges. We would simply not care enough. My observation is that there are spiritual evolutionary reasons why all these conditions are in place. God designed the human mind and physiology with a significant process necessary to change our beliefs and our emotional responses to stimuli so that we would physically survive. And that is the source of many of the ordeals we experience growing up as we change. That is why it continues to be a mantra and saying that people grip onto, that the only thing constant in this world is change, right? We have to keep reminding ourselves that that is happening because that is not what we are inclined to believe or rest on. God also created us spiritual beings, capable of developing spiritually. That is the core of our humanity. And in this case, what I'm studying about secure attachment, the ability to have that is evidence of our being spiritual beings. The storyteller in the Gospel of Mark is here illustrating the cognitive process that we must go through in order to realize that higher, deeper consciousness. That includes then feelings of worth. It includes stability in our sense of self and in our relationships, what I'm calling here secure attachment. So back to the story for a minute here. Jesus fed the people. He satisfied their physical needs, right? And then he sent his closest followers into the storm. I'm suggesting that this is an illustration of what we have to experience in order to change our beliefs from being dependent on physical reality to a consciousness arising from an intimate experience of our spirituality. A simple, perhaps mundane example would be the rising of the sun. It was rather automatic that we eventually accepted the fact that the sun does not rise, that we began to believe the facts of other observations about the earth and the sun. But we needed to have reached a certain stage of mental development to be able to understand that our senses were giving us a false impression. And that is an example of an experience of our being able, acquiring the skill and the ability to put aside what is coming into our senses and instead believe and live from an insight from within, knowledge from within, wisdom and love from within. A more significant example is that because our brain was designed by God to protect its survival and to be able to reproduce itself, we can decide, it can happen that we decide based on unconscious thoughts or urges that something we sense is a threat, and then react by standing our ground, protecting ourselves, regardless of the actual reality. It's like we are ignoring the lesson that our senses are often not accurate in what is the reality. If in our development, For instance, our brains associated yelling with emotional or physical harm, then later on in life, we would have unhelpful reactions to loud people, even if they love us and want to be in a relationship with us. That's the condition of many of the couples I saw in therapy. So instead of knowing what's unconsciously driving us, instead we react to that loud voice, for instance, by fleeing or fighting or denying the reality of the love that the person's trying to offer, because we are favoring that unconscious programming that happened earlier in our life. Sometimes people react violently to defend their position. We can do this from an unconscious urge that has been managing our decision making, or from a false belief that we hold on to, like the need to be right, or from a misinterpreted external stimulus that pulls the trigger on a physiological response. One of the complicating factors here is that our outer life, our natural life, is tied to the material, natural, sensual world, and it only acquires the ability to express ever deeper love and wisdom over time and only with practice. And so we are often clumsy at first. At times, we might even cause harm to our relationships because we are reacting simply from that outer life, that material, natural, sensual knowledge of the world. Because, especially when we are not secure in our sense of self and are habituated to mistrusting others and God from past woundings, we will react from a fear of harm when we believe and accept that those inner changes that are urging us to love and be kind and accepting and trusting, that they are not true. They're not good. So Jesus wants us to know that there's a resolution to this awful circumstance, this inner tension between what's coming in through our senses and what's coming into us from that inner voice, from conscience and from our connection to the spiritual world and to God or higher power, life, the universe. And the resolution to this circumstance is to believe and so live in such a way that we adopt the model described in the gospel of Jesus' secure attachment, his tight connection to his apostles, his unconditional love for them, his constant yearning and helping for them to grow spiritually. And so for us too, he's doing that for us too. And then also we see his practices and the skills he has that is being described in the stories, his ability to stay in the present moment, right? His being not judgmental, loving and caring, never defensive, always rising above the circumstances in his thoughts and in his deeds. Now, Christians believe that Jesus could be this way because he was the incarnation of divine love and divine wisdom. What is, in fact, obvious to anyone who reads the Christian scriptures is that all Jesus taught and all that he did manifests that goodness and that truth. He is a model for what we can be, even if we're finite and imperfect, if we are willing to listen to what he says and learn the lessons from the miracles that he does. Because we are able today, because of this spiritual evolution I've been describing that we are experiencing, we are able to respond to his invitation and encouragement in ever deeper and so more effective ways. Again, many people are afraid of those changes that originate within, that come from perception, from insight within the human spirit. Many people resist those changes, and that is the source of so much of the conflict here in the world. People reacting from that fear. But nonetheless, we are able, if we do the necessary work, to rise above our materialistic and selfish responses to what we perceive as threats from a higher sight and a deeper love. That is what is now possible 2,000 years later, after Jesus did his work of reformation. But in the story, as we read it in Mark 6, Jesus sent his disciples away, and he sends them into the teeth of the storm on the sea. The apostles don't see it, but Jesus does, according to the story. Jesus then goes into the hills by himself to pray. And from this and other accounts, we know what he was praying. He was praying to the Father, searching his divine soul for strength, for wisdom, for insight. He was practicing mindfulness in a manner that you and I can only imagine, even though we can also practice it. But meanwhile, according to the story, his disciples out on the stormy sea feel abandoned and adrift. They are being blown away from their goal, from what they're trying to achieve. And then in the story, there's the part where he walks on the water, a miracle. Of course, startling all of them. But it was not because they saw Jesus walking on water, which was a miracle, but because they thought he was a fell spirit, a ghost, a harbinger of death. And at first he appears to be just walking right by and not stopping. So in my case, I remember many times my need to be right separated me from people. At least I separated myself from them because I was making myself right by making them wrong. You likely have memories of being abandoned, and perhaps you didn't know why. And maybe you were afraid you might lose your membership in the tribe. And there were times that I heard the loving and wise message that I should let go of that need to be right. But my experience was being lost at sea, my life threatened by the storm. I did not recognize the love and truth in the midst of that storm. I'd forgotten it. I did not have access to it. That's both the cause of the storm and the result of the storm. So in the story, it was only when the disciples recognized him as Jesus that they call out to him to save them. So like them, my reflection is that I only recognize the resolution to my pain and my fear after acknowledging the goodness and truth originating in a higher power, a higher and deeper sense of self that has been provided to me by my Creator, by the universe, by the source. This experience, for me repeated many times, and indeed continues to this day, this experience of noticing this higher and naming it, right? Noticing and naming this higher power frees me up to choose on my own to trust and love others because I've experienced being loved by God, being loved by the divine goodness and divine truth. And when that happens, in my experience, that goodness and that truth calmed the storm and gave me a sense of peace and security. Indeed, a sense of my eternal life. So, Jesus invites us to first notice and then to acknowledge the divine truth and divine love, which then free us to believe and live authentic lives of eternal truth and goodness. So our practice is to pause and examine our beliefs and how we have come to have them. We do this every time we pray, every time we have that inner dialogue with our higher power or with the universe, as Jesus modeled for us, being a regular part of our life, thinking of that and contemplating that inner part of us that we know is good and true because it is God in us, appealing to us, inviting inspiration, wishing for perception from that higher part. We do this practice of pausing and examining and reflecting and journaling every time we stop and read our scriptures, whatever they are for us. When we do that with an eye to learn a lesson that it is teaching me. I regularly catch myself reading my scriptures and immediately seeing the lessons it is teaching other people, right? Or how the lesson could be impactful if the world were different, thinking then my life would be better or everyone's life would be better. I'm suggesting instead you take a moment to read your scriptures and see what it's saying about you in your spiritual life. that will prepare you for the change you need to make to adopt its worldview of peace and serenity and trust in God and each other and healthy relationships. While living in this physical world dependent on our five senses, we are not constantly present to our inner life, but there is a divine design that favors developing that awareness. And so, Jesus sends his apostles out in the boat, and of course, there's a storm. Of course, as soon as we begin to do this work, we are confronted by evil and falsity around us when we authentically engage with people, or we see that inside of ourselves when we seriously reflect on our belief system and how we think. Of course, we discover that we believe something false, or we remember that we've done something mean or cruel, perhaps without intending, because it is coming from an unconscious drive that's really there to protect ourselves and to further our goals. And so we find ourselves fighting others or fighting inside our own minds, being confused in our own minds. And oftentimes we notice this fight arises when a new idea is presented to us. Now, in this story, Swedenborg and Gurdjieff and other teachers note that the sea represents falsities, but the boat is true spiritual or religious beliefs. So in one sense, if a new idea arises in our minds, it puts us in a boat in a new way, for a time in a tumultuous, threatening sea of ideas that we've been holding on to for our whole lives up until then. Sometimes we might find ourselves fighting another person, that is, arguing with them, trying to be right or trying to find certainty and so forth. And then we catch ourselves and we realize that we are bothered by having to fight that other person. We might begin to wonder if our relationship is being harmed, and that bothers us. Or we notice that we can't work with someone or we can't be with them. And someone is pointing out to us that, well, that's your fault. You need to be working on that. We're going, no, it's that other person. It's their way of being that is the problem. Well, that's being on this sea with the wind and the waves, fighting against our desire to be good and true and to live an authentic life of love and wisdom. But now, because we've been practicing how to do it, right? We have a mindfulness process that we've been practicing. We are able to step back, look up, and see that this is a new idea that we are writing in, and it will startle us because we will notice then that actually God is present, love is present. There's an energy present to change our ways, to change our beliefs, to change what we are doing and saying. We will see that, in fact, there is no impending death. There is no threat, actually. There is a goodness and truth in what we recognize, which is Jesus walking on the water. And then comes the hard part. In our distress at being lost, at fearing losing something that is important to us, this way of being that we've been living, believing that there's a threat to us, a fear of failure, that we're not good enough, that we're not doing the right thing, that we're not doing what we should be doing. In that moment, we call out, as it were, to that higher inner power from a new consciousness of our own spirituality, our own power, and to be accepting of what is, rather than needing to be in control or make it right or fix it or thinking that we know what we're doing. Right? Remember, in the midst of that ordeal, we do not perceive what is true and what is good. That's what part of the storm is. However, we have practiced allowing our inner life and even our breath to bring calm and serenity to our bodies and to our minds. We are, in effect, calling out for love and wisdom from within. For instance, we might remember that, God is always there. The universe is always on our side. That he does feed us, not just naturally, but he feeds us spiritually. He provides the nutrients for us to live whole, healthy lives. And that God, in fact, cares infinitely for our eternal welfare. And that becomes, therefore, more important than our mere physical life. We remember that God is always responding by restoring a sense of calm. So Jesus is showing us that we can become heavenly through a process, including an ordeal, of experiencing a loving connection, a secure attachment to other people, and so to God. But it takes practice. And that is why we are here on the earth, living in this physical life. We will fail, we will miss opportunities, but we will then, over time, learn how we can change our beliefs. Some of them were erroneous. Some of them were merely materialistic or sensual. Some of them were formed through trauma. But we will begin to accept the authentic and genuinely good ideas that have come into our lives, especially in those troubling times. This is what Jesus promised when he said, "Don't be afraid, take courage, the I Am is here." I pray this has supported your transformative life, whatever practice you have in your life. I want to thank Solomon Keel for his music, and I want to invite you to make a contribution to this work if you wish and are able through the PayPal link. And I invite you to continue to listen to the next episode. You be well.